Turn with me, please, to our little psalm that is our psalm for study this morning, Psalm 131. As we continue to make our way gradually through the Psalms of Ascent, we come this morning to Psalm 131. Page 625 of our Pew Bibles. And before we come to study it, we'll read these three verses, just three verses of this little Psalm 131. Psalm that has a lot to say to us, so much to say to us in every circumstance of our lives, no matter where we are today. Psalm 131, and we'll read from verse 1. O Lord, my heart is not lifted up. My eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me. But I have calmed and quieted my soul. Like a weaned child with its mother, like a weaned child is my soul within me. O Israel, hope in the Lord from this time forth and forevermore. Amen. Please keep that little psalm open in front of you as we come to study it for a little while just now. Psalm 131, this brief little psalm that we have just read, holds out to us something that all of us are looking for, but which is very elusive and which very few people find and experience. It tells us how we can experience contentment, how we can experience a deep inner calm, a pervading peace, an all-pervading peace in all circumstances. In a world where contentment is always the next purchase away, the next holiday away, the next pay rise away, the next promotion away, the next house away, the next relationship away. But that hoped for contentment, it never seemed to materialize. It's always just out of reach. In a world where there are so many things to spoil our contentment and calm, so many things to snatch it away. Things that make us feel anxious, make us feel worried, fearful, disappointed, hard done by, angry. You know, those little things each and every day that spoil our contentment. You know, someone keeps you late. Someone does something to you to frustrate you. Things don't go exactly as you planned. A bowl of cornflakes upended on the living room carpet. Those sorts of things. Or the things that just shatter our contentment. To shatter the very foundation of our contentment. Work pressure, financial worries, anxieties about family, about children, health concerns. Something happens in your life that just shakes your very foundation. You know what? Those sorts of things I'm talking about. In a world where contentment is so elusive, this psalm tells us where we can find it, how we can find it. And it's no coincidence, it's no coincidence that Psalm 131 comes after Psalm 129 and Psalm 130. We looked at those two Psalms last Sabbath day. Two Psalms that deal with particularly painful subjects, two things that cause us great pain, the pain of persecution and the pain of guilt. And then, in God's sovereignty and wisdom, those who compiled the book of Psalms place after it Psalm 131. Which holds out just contentment in those pains, every circumstance of life, how we can have complete contentment and calm and inner peace. And as you know, as I've explained, as we've made our way through this little tranche of Psalms in the Psalm book, these Psalms of Ascent we're working through, Psalms 120 to 134, they were drawn together to be sung by pilgrims making their way on the annual feast to Jerusalem, the city of God, the city where God particularly promised to presence himself with his people. They were sung by God's people as they journeyed to Jerusalem to worship God. And they've been designed by God not simply for pilgrims in the past, but pilgrims in the present. Pilgrims here and now. They've been designed by God to picture the pilgrimage of God's people through this world to the heavenly city. Designed by God to help us, to encourage us, to teach us on our pilgrimage, our journey through this world to the heavenly city. And this particular psalm deals with the subject of contentment, how we can know contentment in all the ups and downs of our journey through this life to the heavenly city. And as you know, these psalms, they come in groups of three. They're placed in triplets. The first focusing on some aspect of the difficulty of our journey. The second focusing on the God who brings us through those difficulties of our journey. The third focusing on some aspect of the heavenly city of which we're a part here on earth and which we're traveling to in heaven. Psalm 131, it's the third in its triplet. So its focus is God's city. The city of God here on earth, of which we're a part, the city of God that we're traveling to in heaven. And the aspect of city life, one of the blessings that we enjoy, being part of this wonderful city life here on earth and that we'll enjoy in complete perfection in the celestial city in heaven, is contentment. Inner peace, calm, complete contentment in every circumstance. It is a song for the content. And this contentment, this calm that Psalm 131 holds out to us, it tells us it comes through the development and the practice of three attitudes, three mindsets: a prideless humility, a patient hush, and a persistent hope. Those are our 3 points this morning as we come to look at this psalm and the contentment that it holds out to us. The first attitude that enables us to experience contentment and calm is firstly prideless humility. Prideless humility. Look at verse 1. The psalmist writes, "O Lord, my heart is not lifted up, my eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me." And what the writer is describing here, the writer who we're told is David is describing here, is an attitude of humility. Prideless humility. A person's heart being lifted up. The heart being a description of our inner self. You know, our mind, our affections, our will, our eyes being raised. Those expressions that David uses in verse 1, those are expressions that are used in the Bible for pride. Pride. Thinking of yourself more highly than you ought. Having an overinflated opinion of yourself or your abilities, your position, your importance. Placing yourself at the very center of your life. Living for yourself, for your promotion, for your exaltation. Pride. That's the attitude that's described here by David in verse 1 in these expressions. It's an attitude, David says, that he has sought to put off in order to experience contentment. It's an attitude, he says, that spoils our contentment, ruins our contentment, undermines contentment. An attitude we need to resist, we need to fight in order to be content. How does pride spoil our contentment? How does pride prevent us from knowing this inner calm? Well, an overinflated opinion of ourselves, of our position and our abilities and our gifts affects our contentment in many ways. It affects our contentment in who we are. It affects our contentment in our identity, our purpose, our value, and what we find meaning in. You know, proudly telling ourselves that that we determine our identity, that I determine what I am, who I am, not God, but me, us. That affects our contentment in who God made us to be, in the people that He made us to be, the gender that He made us, the personality, the talents, the gifts that He gave us. Pride in who we are affects our contentment in who we are. And proudly telling ourselves that we determine how we live. Not God, but us, that we have the right to choose how to live, choose how we behave, how we speak, how we think, that we make the rule. That affects our contentment in the rules that God has laid down for us, how He tells us to live. And it sets us on a path of rebellion against those rules. Pride undermines our contentment. It affects our contentment in our circumstances. Proudly telling ourselves that I don't deserve this. I deserve better than this. This isn't fair. What's God doing in allowing this in my life? God's got it wrong. Telling ourselves that we know better, I know better. If I was in charge, I wouldn't do this. I would sort out things in my life far better than this. That attitude of pride affects our contentment in our circumstances. Pride, David says, an overinflated opinion of who we are and our importance, elevating ourselves above God, taking God's position. It undermines our contentment. And humility. Not having an overinflated opinion of ourselves, but having an accurate opinion of ourselves, a right view of ourselves. Humility, David says, acknowledging our position, acknowledging that we're creatures. We're not the creator. We're not Almighty God. We're simply creatures. We're subject to the design, to the direction, the determination of our Almighty Creator. David says that brings contentment. It brings calm into our lives. Instead of conflict, we experience contentment at who we are, about how we live, and at what He brings into our lives. David draws out a second aspect of the humility that brings contentment. In the second half of verse 1, he says, I don't occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me. It's the questions that run rampant through our minds that cause much of our discontent. Isn't that right? Why would God make me like this? Why does He ask us to live this way? Why is this sin? What's wrong with this? Why would He allow me to suffer this? Why would He do this? What possible reason could He have for putting me through this? What's He doing through this? It's the questions, isn't it? The questioning of God's dealings, the questioning of God's reasons, God's purposes that stir up a spirit of discontent, a feeling of discontent, disquiet within us. And David says these questions, these are too wonderful for us. They're too far above our little finite human minds. They're outside our ability to comprehend. We cannot possibly understand everything that God is doing in every situation in our life. He says contentment is found in accepting that in a spirit of humble submission. Humbly acknowledging that you're not God, that God is. That He's in control. That He knows what He's doing. That He has purposes for what He's doing, even when those purposes are hidden from you. That spirit of humble, submissive acceptance brings a contentment and a calm. David says that this contentment, this inner peace and calm is found in an attitude of prideless humility. Contentment is found in acknowledging in humility who and what we really are. And in all those things that threaten your contentment. Whether it's those tiny things, the flat tire on your way to work and you miss that important business meeting, the important appointment, the burnt meal, the wonderful plans for dinner and burnt, and just ruins your evening. Or whether it's the huge things, shattering diagnosis, the death of a loved one, something just shakes your world. Contentment, David says, is found in a prideless humility. Humble, submissive acceptance of God's position, of God's sovereignty, of God's purposes, God's authority, God's plan. Prideless humility brings contentment and calm to a heart in conflict and crisis. Prideless humility. The second attitude that David describes here, through which we experience contentment and calm, is that of a patient hush. A patient hush. Look at verse 2. But I have calmed and quietened my soul, like a weaned child with its mother, like a weaned child is my soul within me. A patient hush. The word that's translated calmed here in verse 2, it means leveled. It was a word that was used of farmers leveling their ground after ploughing. It was a word that was used of a flat, calm sea. Remember the ploughing, Psalm 129, the ploughing of the pilgrim's back. Remember the tempestuous seas, the distress that the psalmist said in Psalm 130, in which he was drowning in. Here he says, in this simple little word, this leveling word, this calm, he says, in those experiences of being ploughed, those circumstances of being tossed about in the storms of life, he says, I have a calmness. I have a quietness, an inner peace. When he's caught up in the storms of life, when outside the storm is raging and the wind is howling, inside he says, all is calm. All is quiet. Inside he knows contentment and peace. Instead of inner turmoil, instead of anxiety, instead of fear, instead of anger, instead of resentment, instead of railing against God and what God is doing, demanding that God get his act together and sort out this situation that should never happen in the first place. Instead, he says he experiences inner calm and contentment and quiet. Complete contentment in the raging storm. That's what he's describing in verse 2. Now, it isn't a calmness that he experiences passively, that he just sits back and God, through his Spirit, imparts to him. It's a calmness that requires action on his part, that he has to actively engage and pursue. He says it in verse 2, he says, I, not God, he says, I have calmed and quietened my soul. It wasn't God who calmed and quietened his soul, though God does, but what he's talking here is about a calm that he actively engages in. And the calming and quietening of his soul that he's talking about here is the calmness and quietness of patiently waiting on God, waiting for God to act, knowing that he will. It's the waiting that the writer of Psalm 130 wrote about in verse 5 of that psalm. When he said, I wait for God, my soul waits. My soul waits for the Lord. That's where he gets this. That's what he's describing here. Quietly, patiently, waiting for God. The word waiting, meaning eager, patient expectation. That's the calming and quietening that David is talking about here in Psalm 131. Quietly, patiently, waiting on God. Waiting for God to act, knowing that he will. And we know that's what he means by this calming and quietening of his soul because of the illustration that he uses. He says, I have calmed and quietened my soul like a weaned child with his mother. I have calmed and quietened my soul like a weaned child with its mother. Weaning is the process of moving a baby off its mother's milk onto solid foods. And before it's weaned, as you all know, those of you who are parents, as soon as the little baby gets hungry and it feels the slightest bit of discomfort and discontent, the slightest little pang of hunger, what do? They get restless, they get anxious, they start to cry, they try to get their mother's or father's attention by making noise and letting their mother know they're not happy, that they want fed, and they want fed now. They're not prepared to wait for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, no matter how long. They want fed now, demanding instant satisfaction, instant resolution to their distress, to their hunger. And any delay, what does a delay result in? Well, any delay results in louder cries, maybe even an angry tantrum by the little baby. But through the weaning process, the baby is gradually moved off its mother's milk onto solid foods, and off that instant gratification from its mother's milk to the regular routine of set meal times with the family, when they know at those meal times their hunger pangs, their physical needs will be met. That's the picture that David is painting here for us. A weaned child with his mother, not anxiously demanding satisfaction for their needs here and now, instant resolution of their hunger here and now. Feed me now, satisfy me now, take this pain away now. But quietly, patiently, waiting for their needs to be met by their mother. David says, that's the calm that I have learned. That's the calm that I actively engage in. Not behaving like a baby, restlessly, anxiously demanding God's attention, demanding that he does something now to sort out my situation, going into an angry tantrum if God doesn't take my pain away now, my situation isn't resolved straight away. But quietly, peacefully, calmly waiting for God to act, knowing that he will. And by engaging in that act of calming and quietening of the soul, patiently, quietly waiting on God, David says, I know calmness, I know contentment in times of crisis. That's the attitude that just as babies need to learn, that baby Christians need to learn. Paul learned it. We read about how Paul learned it in Philippians chapter 4. In verse 11, he wrote, I have learned. Didn't come naturally to him. He says, I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. And he talks about plenty. He talks about need. He says, I have learned in those situations to be content. He learned to peacefully, quietly, calmly wait on God and to know contentment in waiting on God. It's an attitude that not only Paul needed to learn, but we need to learn. We need to develop in ourselves in order to experience this contentment and calm in times of crisis. And then having learned that lesson, having learned the lesson of contentment through God's weaning process, we have to put it into practice, don't we? Actively calming, quietening our souls, hushing our souls, patiently, quietly, gently, calmly, waiting for God and waiting for God to act. There's no contentment in restless anxiety. There's no contentment in angry tantrums at God, but through quietly and calmly, gently and patiently waiting for him and waiting for him to act. So at all those things that threaten your contentment, whether it's those minor things, dented car, driving into Asda and you come back to the car park to find someone's reversed into you and driven off. something like that spoils your contentment. Things not going as you planned, or the huge things, again, a bereavement, a tragic loss, lose your job, personal rejection, a wandering child. Contentment in those things is found not in losing your head, not in explosive anger, not in restless anxiety or an angry tantrum, but quietly, gently and calmly, patiently waiting on God. That's what the psalmist is. That's what David is saying in verse 2, sorry. Patient hush. Quiet calm brings contentment to a heart in crisis. Prideless humility, patient hush. Thirdly and finally, the third attitude that David in this psalm encourages us to develop and says that through which we will experience contentment is that of persistent hope. Persistent hope. Look this time at verse 3. He writes, O Israel, God's people, hope in the Lord from this time forth and forevermore. Hope in the Lord from this time forth and forevermore. He says calmness and contentment in our journey through life, calmness and contentment in the storms of life, it comes through hope. Hoping for something. And the focus of our hope, he says, the subject of our hope, the one in which we're to place our hope in order to know contentment and calm in all the storms, the crises of life, in order to know this inner peace, that the object of our hope, what we set our hope on, he says, is God. He says, if you want to know contentment, hope in the Lord. Now, as I mentioned last Sabbath night, whenever we looked at Psalm 130, whenever David talks here about hope and he tells us to hope, the hope that he's talking about, the hope that he is encouraging us to have, it is very different from what we think about whenever we talk about hope today. Hope today is little more than wishful thinking. I hope that it's going to be dry tomorrow. I hope the sun's going to come out tomorrow. Oh, whenever you're speaking to someone who's unwell, well, I hope you feel better soon. I hope things work out okay. Hope really without any assurance, without any confidence, without any certainty that what you hope for is in fact going to happen. No certainty that tomorrow is going to be any drier. No certainty that your friend is going to get any better. That the hope that you're talking about, it's little more than wishful thinking. That's all it is, wishful thinking. But that isn't the hope that David is talking about here. Hope that God will somehow work things out. That God will make things better. That everything will be okay in the end, and in that way you'll experience contentment. That's not what David's describing here. He isn't talking about wishful thinking, wishing on a star, as it were, hoping everything will work out okay. Hope in the Bible means being sure of something. It means knowing without a shadow of a doubt that something is going to happen. It is patiently waiting and anticipating in confident, certain expectation for something that you know without a shadow of a doubt is going to happen. That's what that word means. And whenever David says contentment comes by hoping, he means it comes by patiently reminding yourself and assuring yourself of things that you know for sure. Of things that you know for sure. And anticipating with confidence things that you know for certain are going to happen. That's what he means when he says confidence comes through hope. By saying contentment comes by hoping in God, he means it comes by reminding ourselves, assuring ourselves, committing ourselves to what we know about God, to what we know about his character, about his nature, about his word, about his promises, about who we are in God, about what his purposes are for his people, about what his plan for us, about what he's going to do with us and for us. Reminding ourselves, assuring ourselves, hoping in who he is. He is the almighty, all-powerful, sovereign, good and gracious God. Hoping, assuring ourselves in that. Reminding ourselves, assuring ourselves, hoping in what he has said, in his word, his promises things that God, having said that he will do, that we know without a shadow of a doubt he will do, because God never lies. Reminding ourselves, assuring ourselves, hoping in what he is doing. He is working all things together for the accomplishment of his sovereign plan for humanity. A plan that includes the salvation of his people. Working all things in his plan for our good. Reminding ourselves, assuring ourselves, hoping in that. Reminding ourselves, assuring ourselves, hoping in who we are as his people, his precious, blood-bought, never to be abandoned covenant people. Hoping in that. Reminding ourselves and assuring ourselves, hoping in what we're going to experience as his people. The contentment and peace of his heavenly city. He says to know contentment in the crises of life, every circumstance of life. This is where you find it. Hoping in God, trusting, exercising your confidence, your certainty in him. That's where you find contentment and calm. So again, in all those things that spoil your contentment, again, whether it's the minor things, a day gone wrong, just didn't go the way you wanted it to go, plans gone astray, you let yourself down, and that has spoiled your contentment. Or those huge things, those things that just rock your world, painful loss and overwhelming disappointment, just a crushing blow that completely shatters your contentment and calm. David says, contentment is found in a persistent hope, actively hoping, remembering, assuring ourselves, engaging our brain, actively engaging our brains and anticipating with confident expectation what we know with complete certainty and confidence about God, what he is doing, what he's going to do. He says, in that is contentment and calm. Contentment is found, he says, in the crises and the conflict of this difficult journey through life, through prideless humility, a patient hush, and a persistent hope. And in these three attitudes, David is painting a picture for us. He is pointing us to the one who displayed these three attitudes perfectly. The one who is our hope. The very center of our hope. The reason we have hope. He's pointing us to Jesus in these three attitudes. The one who in prideless humility left the worship and the grandeur and the service of angels in heaven to come to earth to die for sinners. The one of perfect, prideless humility. The one who in the face of hostility and difficulty, the awful hostility and difficulty of his Father's plan for him, faced it with patient, quiet calmness and trust. The one who exercised a persistent confidence and hope in his Father and in his Father's plan, even as he hung on the cross. Persistently hoping in his God, what he knew about God, what God's plan was for him, what he was going to do for him. This psalm points to us and it pictures for us Jesus, the one in whom and through whom we can have hope. The contentment and calm that is offered in this psalm, it can be yours today. It can be all of ours today. How? Through a simple, heartfelt, genuine faith in the Saviour who is pictured in the psalm. Faith in him. And living out in our lives the example that he gives us here. And it's not just contentment in this life. It's not just contentment in the here and now, but a far better and a far richer, a far more complete contentment. Complete contentment. Complete inner and outer peace for eternity in heaven. In a city from which pride and every other sin is locked out, in which there'll be nothing to disturb our quiet and our calm, in which everything that we hope for in God is consummated and realized in perfect completeness in His presence, becomes a perfect reality. Complete contentment. Inner and outer peace. Perfect calm. It's what we're all looking for, isn't it? It's what we're all looking for. And trying in our sinful pride to find it in anything else, in anything that this world offers, in any other way, this psalm says. It only leads to unrest and hopelessness. Here's where you find it. Here's where you find it. More exactly, He is where you find it. His prideless humility, His patient hush, and His persistent hope. Amen.